Already I've made some changes of like how I approach just a couple little things. We have a go-kart. I had a go-kart growing up, which is another one of those things of like, it was like a super janky redneck go-kart. My brother and I used to like terrorize our yard and our whole area with them. But my brother rebuilt the engine, gave it to me for my birthday this year. And we live in the suburbs now. So like the idea of having a go-kart in the suburbs is super weird. But I taught my son how to drive it. And like before I would ride my bike next to him all around the neighborhood and just like, tell him like, you got to stop here, look both ways. But he asked the other day, can I take it out alone? And again, normally I'd be like, oh no, he's going to run into someone or a car. But I was like, yep, you can go. Normally before I would have been way more protective. But in those moments, I'm like, this is exactly the type of thing I need to lean into to give my kid who already has some anxiety, just some more experience of like, you can figure things out. And sure enough, one of the days, like the chain fell off the go-kart. It's like a block away, but he figured it out. Like he
put the chain back on?
Problem solved, and he got the chain back on and came back. And I was like, that's super cool that he had a struggle, figured it out. And like, I didn't need to be there to coach him on it. Welcome to Educator Happy Hour, a space for all educators to think, drink, and nerd out together over issues that affect our lives. Whether it's exploring the latest educational research or sharing our embarrassing classroom stories, we're here to have candid conversations in order to connect together and grow together. So grab a seat, grab your beverage of choice, and bring your authentic self. Well, here we are, and officially, like, we're at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central Time, almost like we planned this out. Meaning we are the technologically anxious generation right now. Because yet again, we just spent the last 30 minutes trying to figure out how to simultaneously record a podcast, but also like post it to our Educator Happy Hour Anxious Generation book study group. And like, I think we found a way, right?
Yeah, you were very creative problem solving, Chase. So
we really tried it. We gave it a go. So I'm super excited to dive into like this book study and all of that. But first, just some general updates. You've been traveling. What the heck have you been up to as of late? You've been like driving and flying and flying and driving. What's summer been like so far?
Well, I've been local for the most part with silly trainings and all that stuff. I just got back from Springfield, so that was fun. Nice. And then tomorrow I get on a plane to North Carolina, and then I come back tomorrow on Friday night.
Oh,
so
is it a fun trip?
You have
a fun trip.
What?
Is it a fun trip or not fun trip? Like work trip?
The North Carolina, that one's for a training too.
So super fun trip.
Super fun. Super excited to geek out.
Yeah.
Becoming a coaching leader stuff. So I don't know. Yeah. I'm going to learn.
Love it. It.
And you've been all over. You were like in Alaska or Texas or some other crazy state.
They're kind of the same. Very, very similar culturally, geographically. It was a kind of a whirlwind of like Alabama, Indianapolis, Michigan, and Texas as well. But get a little bit of time off. Now my main issue is just I am 39 years old, but have the body of like a 78-year-old that threw my back out again. And so also added to our technology issues is the past few nights when we've planned on doing this, I've been like really doped up on pain relievers where I thought like maybe we don't show that part of ourselves to
I love that part
of myself to folks. Yeah.
I love that part. I also think that you're still in your 30s. You're too young to throw your back out.
It's bad. It's bad. Like I have had 2 knee surgeries, a shoulder surgery. I have a herniated disc. Like
was this from all the CrossFit that you did?
The herniated disc was just from regular weight training. The knees and shoulder for playing like intramural or like leisure soccer.
This is why I don't do intramurals or weight training.
I'm not built for activity. That's what we're getting at. So let's dive into anxious generation. This is something that you and I were kind of chatting. Like, what do we want to do over the summer with the podcast? And, kind of both separately, we were like really interested in this book, and then when it came out, I was like, oh, we freaking need to do a book study around this. I had seen The Anxious Generation information being like posted about by lots of different people. It like instantly, even just like the title, subtitle resonated with me of like, yes, this is something I see not only as someone involved in education and a former teacher, but I see it with like the professional development I lead. I hear it from teachers and I see it with my own kids. So there are many reasons why it piqued my interest. What brought it to your interest? Like what made you think like, oh, this is a book I want to read?
Well, I'm a big fan of Jonathan Haidt. So
Yeah.
he wrote a book before called Coddling of the American Mind. And
Mm-hmm.
then Jean Twenge wrote a book called
Mm-hmm.
Generations that was recommended to me. And he cites her work. See,
Oh
I'm
yeah.
like totally showing my full blown nerdiness right now. So thank you for accepting me for who I am.
Yeah.
And he collaborated a lot with her throughout it. And I have to be honest with you, the title turned me off a little bit because I was
Oh,
like,
tell me more.
there's so much talk about anxiety,
Yeah.
anxious. I was like, okay, is this going to be another like our poor kids,
Yeah.
like life is so rough for them.
Oh
And I'm
yeah.
oversimplifying, but I should have known better from Jonathan. He
Yeah.
doesn't do that. And so it's really the research that he presents is
Yeah.
so fascinating and
Yeah.
I
For
guess
sure. Like,
affirming too.
yeah, that's one of the things that is similar to like previous nerd. He had written the happiness hypothesis, and I had read that many, many years ago, and didn't make the
Mm-hmm.
connection of like, oh, this is the same person. But once I started diving in, like the one word I would use to describe this book is captivating. In the
Mm.
sense of like, or I should actually, I think a better phrase would actually be compelling. Because like some people aren't
Mm.
captivated by the data so much, but like a lot of the, not only the data, but the little vignettes, the analogies he makes, like it is pretty compelling for people who are on the fence about reading the book or who already like feel like, yes, this is something I want to learn about. Like once you start diving, you're like, holy crap, like this seems to paint a picture. As I was diving into the introduction, and maybe you experienced this as well, like I get super critical. Where like, he'd be talking about a point and I'd be like,
No.
well, what about? And then it was like he would almost read my mind of like, well, if you do actually compare this to other industrial nations, you compare this to Canada, you
Yeah.
compare this to the United Kingdom, and then he'd like bring in data, and I'm like, well, what about COVID? And then he'd bring up more data. Like it was one of
He
those things where
hacked
I was
into
like,
the Chase
dang,
Milky
he
psyche.
did. He's like, let me think of the most like cynical author who's going to try to pick this apart. And he did it really well. Yeah, so like that is some of the why. Now, beyond just like, hey, that topic is interesting, what brought it to your attention in terms of like this might help me as either a parent or a professional?
Great question.
Mm,
Before I answer that,
yeah.
I would like to say that your English teacher wide vocabulary is really showing because you chose great words like captivating, compelling. And the word that I thought of is insane.
Hey, that works. That's a really good word.
So when you're reading, please pick a word. And I would
Yeah,
love to hear your
right.
word. What level of vocabulary we have going on. Because
We'll
we
do
have
a
opposite ends
Lexile
of the
analysis. Yeah.
because the intro story he shared to
Mm,
me, I was like, okay, he's going somewhere with
yeah.
this. And I was like, oh, he got us good.
He
I was
did.
like,
Yeah,
that's
the
insane.
Mars talk.
Mm-hmm.
Like that whole thing. Cuz I'd seen one of the alternate covers is of like a kid in like a spacesuit or something. I was like, what the heck is that about?
Oh,
And then like I started diving in, and it really was like okay, where are we going with this? And about halfway through the vignette you're like, oh crap, I do know where we're going with this. Yeah, for like people who
oh,
love the craft of writing,
interesting.
it was really really well done, that
The
intro.
Mars suit.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to your original question,
Mm,
Chase, is for an educator, we do have kids with more mental health now. Like
yeah.
that is a fact that I
Mm.
don't know if it's a fact, but it's a fact for the kids that I see in our district.
Mhm.
Um, so that was compelling and like what can we do? And then I think also as a parent, because I'm always like,
Oh yeah.
how can I do my part to produce citizens that can contribute to the
Mm.
world? Like, what does that
Mhm.
look like? They're not just these sloths that are going to sleep on my basement couch, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Um, so those were like two of my perspectives. What about you, Chase?
Yeah, that similar dual lens of as a professional, both like that's what I hear from a lot of educators that I do professional development with is just around like
Mm-hmm.
kids like don't even want to try anymore. Like they're so disengaged or they're so like, like any bit of challenge or cognitive struggle that they have and they want to give up. And then I remember like it was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I remember a specific moment with a student kind of around the time that Jonathan Haidt talks about, where like this kid came up afterwards of class and was like, "You can't call on me in class anymore."
Oh,
And I was like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, it just makes me so nervous. And it was fascinating because the student like had an amazing answer when I called on her. Like I
Yeah.
always have kids pair share and practice answers first. Like I give them a heads up. It wasn't like a straight up cold call. But it was just a really interesting moment where it's like, okay, like this kid was perfectly capable and competent in doing something, but because of just the slight discomfort was like dead set on me never calling on them. And that was like the first time I started paying attention to this shift and this change around like, okay, kids like just are not willing to try and to dive in and to put themselves in social situations the way that they used to. So that
Mm,
thread has been on my mind a lot, which really brought me into this book. But then on the personal lens, like I
yeah.
have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, and my 8-year-old was diagnosed with anxiety at a young age, and it's something like
Mm-hmm.
we've seen play out. And so it was kind of that twofold of like, okay, what sort of things might we be doing okay to support him,
Mm-hmm.
and what sort of things do we need to like have some shifts and changes to our approach? So very much both the professional and the personal lens. This really spoke to me as content.
Yeah, for sure. So his theme, Chase, that
Mm.
really resonated with me when he was like, if you take nothing else away from the book,
Mm.
this is my central
Mm-hmm.
message. Am I allowed to share? People
Yeah, for
are,
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Dive in.
So he said, we are overprotective in the real world and underprotective
Mm.
in the virtual world. And
Yes.
that, like, just
Dude.
boom,
Yeah.
right?
That freaking rocked me. It was like
Yeah.
it's such like a no-brainer statement, but I was like, holy crap, this is so spot on.
Yes.
Just like even just thinking back to like, my parents, and I don't remember or know, exactly when you first accessed the internet and what your like family policies were, but like my
Mm-hmm.
family was kind of like, yeah, hop on the internet. And it was like open world. I'd
Yeah.
be on the internet until like 11 o'clock, midnight, 1 a.m. They didn't really know, but B, like they didn't really know the dangers around it. But even just
Yeah.
thinking about that multiplied with screens and smartphones is like, I really saw that lens of like, yeah, we let kids get way more access to the internet than we ever would in person.
Oh,
And
for sure.
conversely, we're like so much more protective of them in person than we used to be. So heck yeah, that
Yeah.
one really spoke to me.
Okay, I have so many things I want to ask you now. I
Yeah,
have one side story before I have a question for you
for sure.
is that I think that in our attempt for our kids to experience technology in schools, like my kids are on their Chromebooks a lot throughout the day. I don't know about your
Mm,
son.
mm,
I've shared this story before that they have this win time and teachers are seeing groups, they're doing independent work. And in first grade, my son knew to watch a full episode of Wild Kratts. And thank
mm.
goodness he went on PBS Kids, but like what else could he be going on? Because they have full access to YouTube. So, like, that's an interesting perspective as a teacher. I know we're all trying our best of having differentiated stuff, like it's
Mm-hmm.
so hard to try to get everyone what they need for independent time. Um, so that came up for me and thinking about like how teachers respond at
Oh
recess.
yeah.
I remember when I was a young teacher, like a kid would climb up the slide. I'd be like, no, don't climb up this slide. That's too dangerous. Like one way only, like I'm like, who cares? Now I'm like, but I was so on them about like how to behave on the
Yeah.
playground.
Yeah.
Um, and we did not have, when I was in the classroom, we did not have one-to-one devices at this time. So I could still monitor looking at the computers. So those two things came to my mind. which leads me
Mm.
to, do you remember how old were you when you had your first like alone experience? He brings up in the book different
Yeah.
generations, their ages when they were alone for the first
Yeah.
time or like able to do something. Do you remember, Chase, how old you were?
Yeah, I love that question. I grew up in the country, very rural area. And so like our closest neighbor was like, at least 100 yards away or more. But I was probably like 8 years old or so, um, maybe even younger, where like we were allowed to like walk through the woods to go to a neighbor's house or like even ride our bikes down the road. Like I remember even being like pretty super young and riding my bike for miles away from my
Yeah.
house, like across like super dangerous like 6-way intersections to go get some candy in the summer. Now, granted, I had an older brother who was a couple years older than me, and so I was always with him. But like we were super young,
Mm-hmm.
and that again kind of resonated with me when he's talking about that of like how tentative I've been for my kid to go anywhere. Like I remember
Mm.
here's another random aside that really spoke to me. I was at one of our local parks. It's a nice little play area, and I was with my daughter, and I heard another parent interacting with their kid, and the kid was probably like 8 years old or so. And I heard the parent scream out at the kid at this like park, like, don't go away, don't wander off because you might get stolen by a stranger. I was like,
Oh,
holy cow.
dang.
Like, that's
She
real
watched
hardcore.
that America's Wanted show a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, like that was pretty recent. I remember thinking like, oh, okay, that's one of those signs of like we are super protective
Mm-hmm.
of our kids. How about for you? How old were? Oh, well, like I remember you telling me like a story of being super young and going out on your own.
Well, I went on an airplane by myself from St. Louis to Taiwan when I was like 8 or 9 in third grade.
That's
So,
insane. That is so wild.
and I totally remember in third grade. So, what are you like 9 in third grade?
Yeah. Yeah.
Of like riding my bike to my friend's house, of just like going
Yeah.
around, getting off the bus by myself, having a key, staying home by myself. I do remember
Mm.
being home by myself in first grade also,
Mm-hmm.
just for like
Mm-hmm.
my mom just went next door for something really quick. Um, so I think I was pretty
Yeah.
young.
Yeah.
And then when I was in second grade, oh my gosh, okay, I really didn't think of this question, Chase, because I lived in Taiwan in second grade in Taipei, and it's like very metropolis, almost like New York
Mm.
City,
Mm-hmm.
tons, like all high rises everywhere. And I would go down the street to the store to buy like snacks and cigarettes for my uncle, and just gave me
Mm.
money. I just walked down and then came home.
And you made it. You
I made it.
survived
I'm still here. I somehow made
to tell
it.
the tale. We'll be back after this. Educator Happy Hour is brought to you by TYS Speakers. Are you looking to inspire your students or staff to not only motivate their thinking, but their actions in school and beyond? Then check out TYS Speakers. TYS Speakers is a group of carefully vetted speakers and professional development leaders whose messages are engaging, evidence-based, and life-changing. Browse the speakers and watch preview videos at tysspeakers.com. Like, so like the counterpoint, and I've heard this a lot of folks is like, oh, well, it's more dangerous now than it used to be.
Mm,
And statistically it's not. Like, that's another one of the pieces that gets brought up, and I had read previously of like violent crime has gone down significantly since like the 1980s and 90s. And I remember reading some post where someone had asked like, millennials, like you always talk about how you used to just like be out all night and your parents wouldn't even know where you were until the lights went on in the streets and then you came home, but yet like you're so afraid for your children. And someone had responded, they're like, we're the first generation that has had a fire hose of information and news shoved down our throats from the moment we became parents. And I think that is a huge contributing factor of like, we hear literally every terrible news story, every terrible thing all the time. And so like a lot of us now as parents have adopted this fear of like, well, it could go wrong. So why take that risk when there's definitely some nuance to that idea of like, maybe we could give our kids more unstructured play and a little bit more independent time so they can actually figure out how to deal with challenges rather than
mm-hmm.
expecting us to coddle them and and save them all the time. That those connections between my personal world and in some of the content from this book like really stuck with me of like, yep, that's true. I got to lean
Yeah.
into that as a parent a little bit more.
What do you think you're going to let your children do now as a
Yeah.
result of
No, so
this?
already I've made some changes of like how I approach just a couple little things. Like we're at the beach the other day, super
Mm-hmm.
busy beach in St.
You
Joe,
say, don't run
Michigan.
away. You might get stolen.
Right. I was like, there's stranger danger. No, but my son was like, hey, so funny. My 8-year-old, he was like, hey, can I go over to that dune area and just like have some alone time? I was like,
I love
okay. And
this.
this was like, it's like 200 yards away. And there are, I'm not kidding, like probably 1,000 people at this beach at the time. And both my wife and I look at each other. And initially, this like previously, it would have been like, no, like that's too far away. But
Mm-hmm.
we're like, no, okay, like you can. And then we're like, hey, if you get lost, go to one of the lifeguards and they'll call out for us. Or if you have an issue, just like call out for help. And like we let him go do his thing. And that was like a moment where like after even just reading a section of this book, I'm like, okay, I have to take those risks a little bit more. We have a
Mm.
go-kart. I had a go-kart growing up, which is another one of those things of like, it was like a super janky redneck go-kart. My brother and I used to like terrorize our yard and our whole area with them. But my brother rebuilt the engine, gave it to me for my birthday this year. And we live in the suburbs now. So like the idea of having a go-kart in the suburbs is super weird. But I taught my son how to drive it. And like before I would ride my bike next to him all around the neighborhood and just like,
Mm-hmm.
tell him like, you got to stop here, look both ways. But he asked the other day, can I take it out alone? And again, normally I'd be like, oh no, he's going to run into someone or a car. But I was
Yeah.
like, yep, you can go. If you don't come back in like 10 minutes, just know I'm going to ride out and make sure everything's okay. So like two very pragmatic moments of normally before I would have been way more protective. But in those moments, I'm like, this is exactly the type of thing I need to lean into to give my kid who already has some anxiety, just some more experience of like, you can figure things out. And sure enough, one of the days, like the chain fell off the go-kart, like a
Oh,
block away, but he
yeah.
figured it out. Like
He put the
he
chain back on?
problem solved and he got the chain back on and came back. And I was like, that's super cool that he had a struggle,
Wow.
figured it out. And like, I didn't need to be there to coach him on it. So yeah.
Oh my gosh. Chase, that's so cool. So, two things I heard. One is
Mm,
that you set boundaries of yes, and
mm-hmm.
like here are the
Yeah.
constraints of what it looks like, what does this mean, how you interact. So you weren't just like, yeah, sure, go to the dunes and like never come back, right? You're like,
Yeah.
here's what it looks like, and here's
Yeah.
how you can get help, and
Yeah.
really setting him up for success. And then the second thing I heard also was it's more about your fear than your
Oh
son's
yeah.
fear.
Yeah. For
And that's
sure.
so important for us to remember as
Yeah.
parents
Yeah.
that we don't put our emotions onto
Yeah.
them.
Right.
And right?
Yeah. Which again, like it almost kind of loops back to like how ironic it is that like we put our fears on our kids. Many of us accidentally put fears on our students in the real world interaction, but sometimes not nearly as much in the virtual world, which
Yes.
is very much to the point of the book. Now, okay, we don't want to give away too much because I know a lot of our readers are diving in. A lot of people might be listening to this and thinking like, oh, now I need to dive in. But I do want to pose one of the questions from our book study group on Facebook. And I want to
Yeah.
see your answer to this one. The second question we asked for like the intro, if you had to pick just one of the foundational reforms
Oh,
that Jonathan
yeah.
Haidt brings up, which one do you think is the most important? So these are the four options. Number one, no smartphones before high school. Number two, no social media before 16. Three, phone free schools. Or option number four, more unsupervised play and childhood independence.
You know, it's really hard for me to pick just one. This is a fact.
We're going to give you some unsupervised selection and just allow you to have some independence in your choice right
Oh
now,
my
Ming.
gosh. I really love this unsupervised play and childhood
Mm,
independence. And I think I'm biased because I have young kids who are in elementary school. My background
hmm.
is in elementary school. Um, so that one I think is like create a strong, solid foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a funny story to share about this. So my parents came and visited us a couple weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
and it's raining outside in May. And my kids are like, we're going to go outside and play. Can we play? I'm like, yep, sure, go ahead. I just wear your rain boots, your raincoats, all this stuff. They're digging, playing outside. And my mom's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? They're such country kids playing out there. They're so just making fun of my children for being out in the mud and so country. And, this is so funny because I'm like, Mom, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing, right? Like, this is what they talk about in Finland. And
Yeah.
I'm like, and so I was like, lots of European countries, their children go out and play. And she's like, oh, really? Okay, whatever. This must be like some new parenting thing, and she's just kind of like, brushed me off.
I love that. It's like new parenting is like the new math. It's all that new math that they're doing. This is
It's
new
like this
parenting.
thing. But on the flip side, what's so funny is I went to Taiwan by myself at the end of third grade. And so my mom was like, how old are the boys yet now? I'm like, they just turned 8. And she's like, oh, they'll totally be able to fly to Taiwan by themselves next year. Like, they're going to be 9. Like, they're way old for that. Like, easy. So it's so funny. Look at your face. Like,
Great.
can you imagine your son going, changing
not only that, but
international terminals?
It's so fascinating of like what sort of things we as parents worry about or that bother us, and what sort of things we're like, oh no, like this is totally like they can do that.
Yes. It's like our stuff on them. Yes. Yeah.
But it still blows my mind that you flew internationally at the age of like 8, 9 years old. Like I've freaked out flying internationally as like a 20-something-year-old. I was like, what do I do? What if I have a weapon I packed and I didn't even know I packed a weapon? All that. Yeah. So
maybe I didn't know better,
So recapping, you said more unsupervised play and childhood independence.
Yeah. What about you?
That was my leaning as well.
Oh, tell me more.
I just think, the one thing I'd posted in the group was like, I feel like if we gave the kids the exposure, some of the coaching, but mostly just like opportunity to experience each other and learn how to deal with conflict and get the joys of human interaction, that would bolster them in the future of realizing that they don't necessarily need to turn to electronics to do that. But I do wonder if that might just be like too wishful of thinking because, we had that growing up, but also like we can also easily get addicted to technology.
For sure.
So it's almost like, even if your kids do have all that unsupervised play and confidence, which we know is linked with a whole host of benefits, like there's still this thing of like social media being intentionally addictive and smartphones being intentionally disruptive to like how we normally think and process, and how phones in schools disrupt the learning process. So it's like maybe the hyper optimistic hopeful in me was like, if you just play more as a kid, it'll be okay.
I have one example of where that actually happened.
Okay.
I have one data point.
Data point of 1.
My friend's daughter, she just finished 4th grade and totally play-based childhood. They really limit electronics. And anytime her friends are over, and she has some friends that already have phones, and she's like, oh, like, let's just play. She's like, she will never choose electronics over friends. And I think part of it's her personality for sure. And I think part of it because play has been such a strong part of her foundation in growing up that she prioritizes that over electronics.
Yeah.
So that's one data set.
That's all the data we need. We are correct. We've solved it. Everyone, we've solved.
We've cracked the code.
Yeah. So like there's so many different things we're going to be diving into in this book.
Yeah.
We're not going to dive into all of them today. We're going to have a series. So this podcast over this summer is essentially going to be us reflecting on some of our readings and reflections from the anxious generation. If you are a listener out there and you want to follow along, like pick up the book wherever you can, hit up your local library or Hoopla, or purchase it from your favorite bookstore and join us on these journeys and these conversations around the podcast. If you want to go deeper in making some connections, we are hosting a private Facebook group for those who are interested, and just find us on social media at Chase Melky, at Ming Shelby, and we will. Is it Ming Shelby, right? Is that your
You got it.
handle?
Yeah.
Okay, got that down. Just
It's
reach
at
out to one of us.
Chase.
We can send you the registration link so that we can get you all the information you need, and then every few days, we're going to be posting a series of questions. We're going to hopefully do some more live-ish events if we could figure our tech crap out. But most of all, this is like no strings, no cost, just like a group of nerds wanting to nerd out together around issues like how do we help our kids develop more confidence, and how do we address some of the challenges that technology, social media, smartphones bring to the learning and the experience of childhood and schools and parents all over the place. So if you care about any of those things and want to read a compelling / insane book, then pick up a
/
copy.
any other word you choose.
Whatever word comes to mind. We would love to have you join along. So I think, unless you've got some other thoughts, closing ideas, Ming, I think we're going to leave it at there for now for this episode.
I think that sounds right. Come
Cool.
join us. Come hang out. And then we can see who's listening and interact. And we'd love to hear from you and hear your comments, and we can learn from you. So it should be a great time. And, of course, there's going to be bumps along the way with Chase and I doing this. So it's just going to be great fun. So come hang with us.
We'll be leaning into it because we are very unsupervised. Someone has given us microphones and they are letting us be unsupervised. And so we're going to get some bumps and scrapes along this technological road. But we'll learn from it.
Chain.
Chain falling off, broken back. I already bring that with me. But we are excited to have you. So anyway, thank you so much for listening, for being a part of this Educator Happy Hour hodgepodge. And we hope to see you on the Facebook group. If nothing else, we hope to hear from you about what you're learning from the anxious generation book study.
See ya.
Cheers.